One of the things that you do is you are the president of the Sustainable Solutions Development Network.
Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN.
And you are very concerned with development in the underdeveloped world, or the developing world, sometimes called the Global South. I was wondering if you could characterize how the Belt and Road Initiative has maybe been helping in the development of the Global South. And maybe also, how does that complement some of the U.S. initiatives, and how can they work together?
So first, I don't like the term Global South because I think we should take geography seriously, and it's not the South. It's more complicated than that. It's actually a little bit the middle. Most of the poverty is in the equatorial and middle latitudes, whereas the places more northern and more southern tend to be more developed in the world for a lot of interesting reasons. But in any event, putting aside nomenclature, we have a very economically divided world. We have about 1 billion people, or 1/8 of the world, in the so-called high-income countries. We have half the world in the so-called low-income or lower middle-income countries, so about 4 billion people. And that leaves about 3 billion people in the so-called upper middle income countries, of which China is a lead economy. So the world's divided, and the real huge division is between the rich and the very poor. About 1 billion people in the really poor countries, with a heavy concentration in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a long story of why Africa is as poor as it is today. Depends a lot on history, a lot on geography, and I've spent most of my professional life thinking about that question and trying to work to overcome it. Suffice it to say, right now, it's interesting. Africa as a whole, if you add in the sub-Saharan Africa with the North Africa, the population of Africa as a whole is 1.4 billion people. That's the population of China, and it's the population of India. So we have 3 big regions. And if you add the 3, that's more than half the world population together. So China has had spectacular economic growth over the past 40 years. India has pretty good economic growth right now, actually about the fastest in the world. It lagged behind China in taking off, and it lagged in the rate, but now it's doing rather well. And then comes Africa, which is still poor and not really having this kind of rapid growth. But my view is that Africa could have the same kind of dynamism that China had after 1980, especially, and that India's had, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. Same size population, very young, and could be quite dynamic. But what are the problems? Well, the first problem is that China's one country, and India is one country, and Africa, with the same population, is 54 individual countries, every one of which is too small on its own to make the kind of breakthrough. So why is it 54 countries? Well, because Africa was completely colonized by Europe after 1885, almost without an exception. And the imperial powers divided up the continent with arbitrary lines. And by the time the colonial era ended, there was Africa with 54 countries, and some very small, 14 of which are landlocked, which is quite tough. You know, being a landlocked province in China, you have a port, but being a landlocked country in Africa, you don't have a port. And so my first point is that Africa should think like a unified structure. And that's why the African Union is so important in my view, because if there were one big market, it would be much easier. Also, diplomatically, Africa would be much more dynamic. Then the second point is Africa needs investment. If you look at how China developed, there was massive investment over a 40-year period. And when I say investment, it's not only the physical things, it's also investment in people.
Right.
The education standards rose tremendously from 1980 to 2022, tremendously. And so this is also what Africa needs. And then your question about the Belt and Road Initiative comes in that context, because the Belt and Road Initiative is basically a system of financing infrastructure, with China taking a lead in partner countries to say, look, we'll help with the long-term financing of roads and power systems, digital and other backbone networking that you need for economic development, whether it's the roads, the ports, the power grid, the digital system. That's what Belt and Road Initiative is. And so this is a very positive initiative, in my view. Of course, it needs to be investing in the right things. And I think there are two issues that where the Belt and Road Initiative is getting much better than it was at the start, because it's an innovation. So at the very beginning, basically, the Chinese government asked the counterparts, what do you want? And we'll help you get it. Well, some of these countries said, we want a sports stadium in the president's hometown, or we want a road to the president's hometown, or we want a rail to the president's hometown. In other words, local politics, not good economics. And China, being China, said, we don't interfere in the internal decisions of other countries. If that's what their priority is, we'll help fund that. I think China should be more systematic, saying, maybe that isn't your highest priority. Let's discuss together. Let's learn how we develop so fast. What you really need is a digital backbone and a power grid and so forth. So more discerning would be helpful, actually. That's, I don't mean crude, gross intervention. This is what we're going to do, like it or not, but rather being a little bit skeptical of lousy projects. So this is one thing. The second thing that is important is that these investments should be green. China began with the launch of the Belt and Road, funding a lot of coal-fired power plants, because these countries said, look, we need electricity. The fastest way to electricity is a coal-fired power plant. And China said, yes, you need electricity. That's basic for your development. And we know a lot about coal-fired power plants, and we'll help you build them. But the truth is, we don't need more coal-fired power plants. What we really need is electricity that is also environmentally safe. And so for many years, I kept advising the Chinese government, make it a green Belt and Road Initiative, because we need the investments actually to be sustainable. And the government's really moved in that direction. And I think that that's extremely positive.